Hello and welcome back to the Fantasy Playmakers. What's up, guys? For today's video, I'm going to be going through some of the safest wide receiver picks that you guys can make this year for fantasy. So these are guys that have shown in years past they can put up very consistent, solid fantasy seasons. They also don't have a lot of injury history, and overall, I just think their profile makes them almost bust-proof. And so I'm going to be focusing in on 4 different wide receivers for this video. And the first one is going to be Allen Robinson from the Bears. And what makes Allen Robinson so special is that he's basically quarterback proof. You know, that's one of the most underrated aspects of a fantasy wide receiver. A lot of these top guys, you know, if their franchise quarterback goes down, you're going to see a big dip in their production. We saw it last year, you know, with Dak Prescott's injury. Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb were both putting up wide receiver 1 numbers, and then Dak goes down, and you know, they both take a pretty solid fall off. But that just doesn't really happen for Allen Robinson, and it's because he's just played with such terrible quarterbacks. In his career, he's played with Blake Bortles, Mitch Trubisky, and Nick Foles, and now he's likely going to have Andy Dalton starting this year. And so injuries to his quarterbacks basically don't affect him. And I mean, in reality, it's because his quality of quarterback is basically that of a backup. But, you know, I mean, he's still able to produce with those quarterbacks. I think Robinson basically has the same floor and ceiling if the number 1 quarterback, Andy Dalton, is on the field, or if the QB3, Nick Foles, is playing, which is just really solid overall for Allen Robinson's consistency. But this is really the first year that Allen Robinson actually has some promise at the quarterback position. It seems like the Bears are determined to start the season with Andy Dalton, but if Fields does get in the game, it could give Robinson a much higher ceiling that he hasn't had in years past. But still, no matter who's quarterback for Robinson, he's basically a lock to be one of the most targeted players in the NFL. He was number 4 in targets in 2019, and then number 3 in targets last year in 2020. And he also doesn't have a detailed history with injuries. He tore his ACL in 2017, but since then, he's been incredibly healthy. He's only missed 3 games in the past 3 seasons, and obviously he's shown that he can produce at a borderline wide receiver 1 fantasy level, even after that ACL tear. So there's just a lot of things going in Allen Robinson's favor. You know exactly what you're going to get from him. He's going to get a ton of volume. He's also a super solid red zone option for the Bears. They really just don't have a lot of guys to pass the ball to. And then also, it really doesn't matter what happens at quarterback. Allen Robinson is still going to be putting up very respectable fantasy numbers week in and week out. So he is definitely one of the safest wide receivers that you guys could be drafting. Next up, I've got Robert Woods, who is basically the definition of consistency and has just been a crazy solid wide receiver 2, basically his entire career, but especially in the last 3 years. So in 2018, Robert Woods finished as the wide receiver 16 in points per game, and this is using half PPR scoring. Then in 2019, wide receiver 18. Then in 2020, wide receiver 19. So just 3 straight seasons of mid-tier wide receiver 2 production. Obviously seems to make him a pretty safe option. And he's also another guy who seems to be quarterback proof, just like Allen Robinson, but it's kind of for different reasons. It's more because Robert Woods is utilized in ways that, you know, don't really need a top-tier quarterback. They like to get him involved in jet sweeps and screen plays. They like to get the ball into his hands quickly and, you know, let him produce after the catch. He's not a guy that needs a quarterback to go out there and chuck it 40 yards down the field to him. Quarterback just needs to hit these quick passes, quick screens, quick slants, and let Robert Woods work, which obviously makes him quarterback proof. You know, really anyone can be making those plays. And what's different this year from the past 3 seasons is I do think he should have a much higher ceiling this year because you do have that quarterback upgrade from Jared Goff to Matthew Stafford. I think that's going to make a huge impact, especially in the touchdown department, because you look at Robert Woods, I believe he had 8 touchdowns last year. Cooper Kupp saw a huge regression in touchdowns, only 3 receiving touchdowns. And so I think both of those guys should see an increase in touchdowns just because this offense as a whole is going to be much better. It's going to be a higher scoring offense, which should benefit both of these wide receivers. And I expect Woods and Kupp to both light it up this year, but I do think Woods is the safer of the 2 wide receivers because it really just doesn't matter how unlucky he gets with touchdowns. He only scored 3 touchdowns in 2019, but still finished as a mid-tier wide receiver 2. We saw Cooper Kupp fall off last year, because he only scored 3 touchdowns. And so it doesn't matter if Woods gets unlucky with touchdowns. He gets enough work in the receiving and rushing game that he still finds a way to finish as a wide receiver too. All right, now it's time to talk about Brandin Cooks, who I think is honestly one of the most underrated receivers in the NFL. And I think I was honestly underrating him prior to kind of digging into his stats. He truly is like criminally underappreciated in the NFL. He's logged 1,000+ receiving yards in 5 of the last 6 seasons. That is not easy to do. And that doesn't only speak to his production on the field, but it also speaks to his ability to stay on the field, which I think is something that has been criticized, but almost like wrongfully so. I think a lot of people are very concerned about his concussions, and it is a very legit fear, but he's only missed 3 games since 2015, and no player who's being picked this late in the draft has a flawless profile. So if that's really the only negative thing about him is that he has concussion problems, but it hasn't even led to him missing many games, I mean, I'll take that as a negative. I understand that this Texans team is going to be a dumpster fire, but they still have to go out and play the games, and when they are playing, Brandin Cooks is going to be the #1 target on this team, and he can put up fantasy points as a big play guy, but he can also put up solid numbers as a volume receiver. He had 6 games last year with a reception of 30 or more yards, but then he also received 8+ targets 9 times, so you can see that big playability combined with that volume. And also, you don't have Will Fuller in this offense anymore, so he was putting up those solid fantasy numbers as the wide receiver too. Obviously, it's going to be a huge downgrade at quarterback. You're going from Deshaun Watson to Tyrod Taylor, but he should see an increase in work just because now he is operating as the wide receiver 1. And right now, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 42, and that's around players like Michael Gallup, Marquise Brown, and Mike Williams. And I just think he has a much higher ceiling than these guys, but he also has a very solid floor because you just know they have to get him involved. They don't really have many other guys to throw the ball to. So Brandin Cooks, another solid option this year. The last player I'm going to talk about is Cole Beasley from the Bills. And honestly, his ADP does not make a ton of sense to me. He is being picked as the wide receiver 54, which is just super late, despite finishing as the wide receiver 37 in 2019 and wide receiver 32 in 2020. And really, the only major change that has happened this offseason was that John Brown left, went to the Raiders, and then the Bills brought in Emmanuel Sanders. And I do understand if you're trying to project, a slight decrease in Beasley's numbers because you have Sanders coming in the wide receiver room. He may get some more slot work than John Brown did. But I mean, wide receiver 54 is crazy. Beasley owns the slot on that Bills team. Sanders only took 26.3% of his snaps from the slot with the Saints last year, compared to Beasley, who had the 5th most slot snaps in the NFL. And so I just think that Beasley has an established role in this offense. He's seen 100+ targets in his 2 seasons with the Bills, and I don't really see that changing much. And so I think right now he is solidly lined up to majorly outperform his ADP and is a super safe late round pick if you're playing in deeper leagues or even, 12-team leagues if he's like the last guy you're picking on the board. Very solid pick. All right, that is going to wrap it up for today's video. I went through 4 wide receivers that I think are very safe for this fantasy football season. It's Allen Robinson, Robert Woods, Brandin Cooks, and Cole Beasley. I really like all of those guys in terms of their safety and would feel very confident drafting them this year. But that is going to wrap it up for today's video. If you guys enjoyed the content, just please leave a like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. Then also make sure you guys let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. That's all I've got for today. Thank you, and see you guys tomorrow.